ever wondered about what the early rabbis had to say about beer for either Kiddush or Havdallah? Well, that's exactly what we're discussing on this 192nd episode of the Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. For this conversation, for this beer for Kiddush, for Havdallah, beer is not part of the story at first. It is wine. And I think people are well aware that wine is, like I like to call it, is the chosen beverage of the chosen people. Okay, so wine is special, has a privileged position for our people, in our traditions, and what we do. And that really comes out in text number 1. Here we are. This is the classic, this is really the fundamental starting position for any understanding of what Kiddush is, and this is really where the rabbis come up with this. They say, what is this day to remember, the day of Shabbat to sanctify? This is part of the 10 Commandments, right? Right there, this is not an obscure Torah text, the 10 Commandments, right? It's right there, and the rabbis understand this as a drinking text. They understand this. How do you do this? They say, make zochrehu al hayayin. You make mention of Shabbat over wine. Okay? So now they understand that Shabbat has this connection. We sanctify Shabbat by using wine. And then it says, only during the day. Whereas then it has this question about the timing, and they say this is really how you kick off Shabbat. This is a nighttime thing that you do. This is where Kiddush happens, and wine, okay? So it sounds like wine, right? And only wine. Mm-hmm. So now we have text 2, and both, I want to point out that text 1, 2, and 3 are all Tannaimic. That means they're early rabbinic. This is really setting the precedent, the foundation. Mm-hmm. And text 2 is, one may recite Kiddush only over wine. And then there's a confusing thing, we only bless upon wine, which then the Gemara goes into. I'm setting that aside. So it sounds like it has to be wine, right? From text 1 and 2, it has to be wine and no other possibilities. Text 3 comes along, and we see very similarly, by the way, we've only seen talking about wine, but now this one takes it head on, beer, okay? So it says, we don't do Kiddush over beer. Beer is out. It is not possible to use this delightful beverage that we have in our hands, beer, for Kiddush. But then we have this minority opinion sneaking in, and it's said from Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon's name, we actually can use this beautiful beverage of beer for Kiddush. Now, it is a minority opinion, okay? I do want to point out, at least we know that it was not entirely unanimous, that beer is out, but still.
Well, it was very clear in the previous quote, it's only wine.
Yeah.
It doesn't say just wine, it says only wine.
Yeah, only wine. Right. Now, I do also want to point something else out before we get to the next one, which is that, and I think this is true for the next one, these are all early rabbinic texts. They're all Tannaimic. These were all composed Israel. So these are all composed in Israel. And I like to think of every land having their own privileged beverage that has primacy there. And what is the beverage of the land of Israel? It's wine. Okay, so just putting that in the back of our minds. Okay, wine has primacy. Beer is, they're clearly aware of beer for beer existing and thinking about it for Kiddush, and a minority opinion, but really not in play.
Levi Shadar Rabbi Shikra bar Talesar Megane. Levi sent Rabbi a beer of 13 soakings. He tasted it, and it was especially pleasant. He said, a beer like this is fit to recite Kiddush over and to say upon it all the songs and praises in the world. Kol shiros v'tishbachos shevo'olam. B'leilos eira, at night it caused him pain. Amar, he said, miyasrin u'mefayis. In pain and it soothes.
Ouch. What are some things that we can understand about beer and their understanding? And by the way, I'll also say Rabbi, there's Rabbi Yehudah HaNasi, it's not the clearest thing, and he is at this pivotal moment between the Tannaim, the early rabbis, and then transitioning later on into the Ameimar. He's the editor of the Mishnah, so he's still sort of at the tail end here, and he is coming from he has an Israeli geographical context. So I think we can understand that their understanding of beer, and first of all, it sounds like he's not used to having good beer. Right? This has been done 13 soakings, so it's like apparently very flavorful.
What is it? What is that? Do you know what that means? 13 soakings?
I'm not exactly sure. Here's what I think it means, is that it's been, maybe, I don't know if it's fermentation. I think it could, so that's one leading possibility. Another is like it's literally soaking there, getting more flavor somehow.
So the original beer from the region was a fermented, almost stew, and had chunks of bread in it. That's what the Egyptians would.
So that's going to be more biblical. That's true. That's what they did biblically. Talmudically, I think they did
At
more.
that point, it was probably refined.
Yeah. And it seems like, oh, I need to say something. The soaking, sorry, what were they soaking? Okay. Now, look, we do know that 2 of the 7 species of the land of Israel are barley and wheat, so it's not like Israel is devoid of these grains. And they made beer using these things, but the primary thing that they used for fermentable sugars for beer was dates, actually. So I think the soakings could have been having the dates soaking in the water to then get the sugars going and then get the flavors out of it. So I think that's really what's going on. But I still think it could also be the what's it called? The straining, the filtration. Whatever it is very clear that this is not normal. This is a higher level of beer production than they're typically used to. And also that his exclamation, this is fit to say all the shiros with tishbachos in the world, he's not used to having such incredible beer. Right. So that probably is a window into what they were used to having in Israel, that beer did not hold a candle to wine. Beer was notably inferior compared to wine. And so maybe
it would be an insult to Shabbat, to the Kiddush, to make Kiddush using an inferior quality.
Right, and that's probably also shedding light onto text 3, why it was only a minority opinion you can even possibly consider it, because it just didn't compare to wine. They're very not used to beer tasting this good, and now he's like, oh wait, this probably fits. This should be worthy of being now considered for even any time that one would use wine ritually. Maybe we should consider beer. Until what happened that night. His digestive system didn't agree. So I'm not really I guess that sort of ends that story, that conversation. Like, well, I guess we're going to remove this from consideration. I don't know.
It's a revenge.
Yes, it's a revenge. But I think what's utterly clear is that this was abnormally good tasting beer, and they weren't used to having beer on the same level as wine. They're used to being a much differentiated flavor experience. So I think that's our opening act, as it were, that you have this early foundational period where, especially coming from Israel, wine is far superior. It's barely considered. Only minority opinion allows for beer. But maybe, possibly, if it were good enough, delicious enough, it might be almost on the level of wine. Hey, wanted to break in there. I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I wanted to break in and give you a sneak peek into next week's episode on a really intriguing new distillery that just popped up in the last year that's making some really intriguing stuff. Here's a sneak peek.
We just walked the absinthe out to the bar and everybody was very happy to see it.
Hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into Songdog Farm Distillery. That'll be coming out next week. And now back into this episode on beer for Kiddush and Havdallah in the Talmud. 5 and 6 are pretty similar. This is sort of like, now we saw in text 1, Kiddush, right? The textual piece of connecting the wine for Kiddush. Great. This, in text 5 and 6, we see, at least this is Rabbi Yochanan's history telling of how this came to be, right? So, because when we saw in text 1, and the early rabbis didn't talk about how did it, we have no origin story for the connection of, or Kiddush even. Okay. What's the connection? Text 5 and 6 are pretty similar, so we're just going to skip ahead to 6.
It was also stated, Rabbi Bar Abba said, Rabbi Yochanan said, the members of the great assembly established for Israel blessings and prayers, sanctifications and Havdallah. Initially, they established it in prayer. When they got wealthy, they established it upon the cup. When they returned to poverty, they established it in prayer. And they said, one who makes Havdallah in prayer, it is required that the person makes Havdallah upon a cup.
Thank you. So this, I did talk about Kiddush. It's not really clear if this is actually having anything to do with doing Kiddush over a cup, but it is clear that Havdallah is to be done over a cup. And there is also this connection with material, how well materially resourced they were. Were they able to, at the conclusion of Shabbat, have wine every week, or was this not something that people were able to do on a widespread basis. So they were at least sensitive to the material realities and what people could afford.
It seems like they're saying it's either over wine or it's over prayer.
But ultimately the conclusion is, even though you all have already done Havdalah in prayer, you still say it over a cup. Although I also find it funny that it just says a cup, but I think it's very clear that their assumption is wine.
Right. Okay.
And we're going to see, this is on the back side of this page, but we'll see that there's a very clear assumption that this is wine, and they don't even need to state that it's not just saying, well, there's a beverage in this cup, whatever that beverage may be. It's very clear that they have this assumption it's wine. Hello, dear listeners. It's your host, Rabbi Drew. I wanted to break in right now and just say, hey, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate, or watching, however you're consuming this content. And I'm always open for new ideas, both for specifically the Jewish Drinking Show, whether it's topics, whether it's guests. I'm also looking for other resources that I can provide you with in the Jewish Drinking Project more broadly. Also, I'd really like to offer you the opportunity to sponsor this work. Whether if you want to go to patreon.com/Jewish Drinking, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you have ideas for swag, also, please feel free to send them to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. All right, thank you so much, L'chaim, and now back into the episode. Text 7, I think, relates back in some ways to text 4 and ultimately to text 1 through 3.
Rabbi teaches the sages render the legal status of the beer storages in Babel like that of the wine storages in Israel.
Thank you. So now the context for this statement, and this is in the early part of Tractate Pesachim, where they're talking about where you need to check for chametz, where maybe rodents could have dragged chametz somewhere, and you need to check. So, and they talked about you need to check your wine storages. For the early rabbis, the Tannaimic rabbis said you need to check your wine storages. So then he's coming and saying, okay, well they don't really have wine storages so much in Sasanian Persia and Babel. So he's saying, you know what, it's basically the same thing. Now, why is it basically the same thing? They didn't have the same amount or access to wine in Babylonia as they did in Israel. Because Israel is a wine country. But what is Persia? We don't know this today because of they're not so into beer these days there, but for other reasons.
Bring airlift over.
Yes. But back in those days, this was pre-7th century, okay? Pre-7th century CE, they drank there. And what do they drink? Predominantly beer. Now, they probably still had wine access, but clearly they didn't have the same amount of wine as they did in Persia, but that they did in Israel. However, what they did have, wine or beer. They had beer in Babylonia.
Ḥisda said to them, Rav said as follows, Ameimar Rav said as follows, Kishem she'en makdishin alav, kach ein mavdilin alav. Just as one may not recite Kiddush over beer, so one may not recite Havdalah over it. Which I don't believe is possible. Right.
We're taking things one at a time.
Exactly. Next, Yitamar Navi, it was also stated, Amar Tachlifa bar Avini, Tachlifa bar Avini said, Amar Shmuel said, Kishem she'en makdishin alav, just as one may not recite Kiddush over beer, kach ein mavdilin alav, so one may not recite Havdalah over it. That sounds familiar.
Yeah. Thank you. So here, and both Rav here and Shmuel here so Rav and Shmuel are first generation Amoraim and leaders of the generation too. And they're like the generation after Rabbi. And they're roughly contemporaneous, maybe even slightly earlier than Rabbi Yochanan. But they're clear leaders, and both of them unequivocally state that Kiddush and Havdalah have the exact same no beer rules. So we already saw earlier that beer is not for Kiddush, and they're saying we're making these things equivalent, that Havdalah has the same rule, we don't do it over beer. That both Havdalah and Kiddush, no beer. And it seems clear. I mean, it's obviously a cliffhanger, and it's not the final thing. And it's Talmud, so nothing's really fully clear, but for now, that's where we're leaving this cliffhanger. I remember one of the first times I had a conversation with someone when they were interested in bringing me out, actually entirely based on this, the Jewish Drinking Show. They liked the content, they liked what they heard from me, and they wanted to bring me out. And during our conversation, they said, hey, we know you have a lot of really great content, but we saw somewhere that you do tastings also. I said, I do lead tastings and I do texts and tastings. So I realized I did not do a good enough job, certainly on the show and probably in general, and letting people know, in addition to actually sharing really wonderful content about drinking and Jewish wisdom, history, tradition, literature, and more. But I also do tastings, and even better, marrying the two together, doing texts and tastings. So if that's something that's of interest to your shul, organization, JCC, whatever it may be, feel free to get in contact with me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. So thank you for letting me break in and share that with you. And now back into the show. Text 8, we saw Rav. Now, I did not tell you at the time, but that would not be our last time seeing Rav. In fact, we're going to see him a few more times, at least here, through our next several texts.
Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Martha said to them, not much time has passed since Rav died, and we already have forgotten his halachic rulings. Many times I stood before Rav and saw that sometimes he preferred bread, and he would recite Kiddush over bread. But other times he preferred wine, and would recite Kiddush over wine. Okay.
So this is very strange. This is the only instance we have in the Talmud of a rabbi, instead of doing Kiddush over wine, choosing bread.
Yeah.
A little bit of choosing bread. Now, it's interesting because we assumed that Kiddush is a drinking activity, and here he is doing eating. But it's not all the time. Sometimes he'll do wine, and sometimes he'll do bread. Really interesting. And again, this is Rav.
But if you don't have wine...
We're not there. He clearly has wine, and he is choosing his predilection. He is choosing bread over wine. That's his choice. Before we even discuss this any further, I think it's also important to see the next text. Would somebody like to read this drinking story?
Rav was found by Rav Huna reciting Kiddush over beer. He said to him, Abba has started to acquire coins with beer.
Okay, thank you. So this is a little bit, it's very terse, so it's a little bit unclear, but I'll clarify this. So one time, Rav Huna, who is a student of Rav, so Rav Huna is a second generation, he is a student of Rav, he found Rav, and he was apparently making Kiddush over beer. And then he makes this statement, oh, you must have started to acquire coins with beer. Like, you've been making money off of beer, you clearly have, you've been generating coin, but you've been making a lot of money with beer, you're doing some beer production, you're selling it, he probably has a fair amount of it to go around. Now, this is really interesting because text 10 and 11, both of them, is not Rav telling anybody this is what he's doing. This is being reported by his students. So in text 11, which actually takes place before text 10, right? We have an actual back and forth dialogue, or his student says to Rav, you're doing this now, and he doesn't, there's no recorded retort or response or even justification, because we already read in text 8 that Rav said you cannot do Kiddush over beer, but here in text 11 he's discovered to be doing this thing that he said you cannot be doing. So, I don't know exactly what to do with that. It seems contradictory that even this person who says you cannot do Kiddush over beer was doing it. And then posthumously in text 10, we see that another student said, and it seems like he says many times they stood before Rav and this and that. So he clearly had numerous occasions to be on a Friday night experiencing his teacher and seeing what he did for Kiddush. And also, it seems like he knows, and Rav is aware that this is what his student is watching him, and maybe other students are watching him, so this is a little bit more public. He's doing bread or wine. But in 11, it sounds more like this is a one-off, and just by one student. So that's a little bit, I don't want to say like, oh my gosh, it's a whole thing, it's terrible, but it is certainly curious.
Ḥisda, who said, if I were not a beer manufacturer,
I will not become wealthy.
Okay, thank you. So there's no context to this, but it'll become readily apparent. And just for context, Rav Ḥisda is the student of Rav Huna, who's a student of Rav. Okay, so that's where we see the chain of tradition.
But we comment about acquiring coins.
Yes, so Rav, who's the first generation Amora, was making money off of beer, and now Rav Ḥisda, the third generation, is also making money. Also, we did see in text 8 that Rav Ḥisda quoted something of Rav's. It's not really clear how much direct interaction they had, but it could have been indirectly through his teacher Rav Huna. So Rav Huna, Rav Ḥisda. Okay. Hey there, I wanted to break in yet again. Although I asked for support in financial ways because it does cost some money to make the hosting happen and other aspects of Jewish drinking happen. So your financial support is definitely appreciated. And don't forget, you can go to jewishdrinking.com/donate. But also, another way of supporting the show and everything that Jewish Drinking does is also to tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you like this content, if you like this show, maybe people you know also like it. So feel free to let them know, hey, I have this interesting episode I heard, or a few episodes, or whatever it is, or even a few clips. Feel free to share with your friends. All right, thank you so much. Now back into the show.
Rav Huna raised the dilemma before Rav Ḥisda. What about the ability to recite Kiddush over beer? He said, now, if barley beer, fig beer, and beer produced from berries, I raised a dilemma before Rav, and Rav before Rav Chia, and Rav Chia of Rabbi, HaNasi, and he did not resolve it for him. Is it necessary to ask about beer?
Okay, thank you. So this is, there's a lot of things going on here. One of the most fascinating things, and I don't know how many times in the Talmud this actually happens, but it seems pretty rare that you have to keep going up the chain, so to speak. Now, clearly this is, when Rav Huna is responding to his student Rav Ḥisda, and he said, oh, well, I asked my Rabbi, he asked his Rabbi, who asked his Rabbi, who asked his Rabbi, like, that's not a very common thing in the first place, so they kept having to go back. But also, wildly fascinating that it's not really clear, and none of them wanted to actually definitively say yes, no. Like, they're all kind of,
Because these guys are all in the beer manufacturing business.
so that's also interesting. Who is who here, right? So, and we've met all of these rabbis so far. So Rabbi Yehudah HaNasi, we already saw earlier, having in text 4 been sent this really incredible beer, this phenomenal beer, just like our final beer for the night. This incredible beer, and he's like, oh, this might actually be on the level that we should consider for special, for ritual use. But clearly, beer is not something he's normally used to drinking that was actually good. Rabbi Chia, we saw talking about how beer is much more plentiful, is as plentiful in the land of Babylonia as it is in the land of Israel. We saw Rav before, right? Rav, who sometimes did beer, wine, or bread for Kiddush. Rav Huna even. So it's interesting. But also, like, what are these beers? It's not really clear. Are these better? Are these worse? But I think one thing that seems to be clear is it's not the same level as non-specified beer. Now, non-specified beer means date beer for our purposes. What is this? And it's also strange they're not willing to make a definitive response, say yes, a verdict, or definitive verdict. So it's also a little bit curious that they're still willing to consider these in play. And maybe, he says, is it necessary? Can you even ask about beer? That's the way he answers it. Can you even ask about beer?
Can you make a definitive statement? Right?
Well, if he's saying, can you even ask about beer? What does that mean? Wait, that's a little bit ambiguous. If you think about it, okay, so Rav Ḥisda, we already saw in text 12. He's gotten wealthy through beer brewing, right? So beer is very much part of his life. And he wants to know, if you think about who is he in this drama, he's someone who loves beer. He has a lot of beer in his life. And we also see that Rav's part of this, and Rav himself probably was doing some beer brewing, and on the DL was doing some beer for Kiddush situation. But is it possible that, so if we play with this, there's two possibilities here. Either these non-date beers are better than date beer. And the reverse is the opposite, right? Is the alternative. So what if this trilogy, this trio of beers are worse? Okay, what if they're worse? But beer, how could you even ask about regular beer? Which is kind of strange. It might actually work better. Meaning, what if these are worse than regular date beer, right? If they're worse than regular date beer, and they weren't willing to say yay or nay, so maybe date beer should definitely be included. The two possibilities: one is that these are superior to date beer.
Right.
But the problem with saying that is if they weren't willing to rule on this, then why would that definitively? Why would you know the place of date beer in this conversation? Then maybe that's kind of unclear. I think it actually works better if date beer is superior to these trio of alternative beers. That if these rabbis weren't willing to definitively provide a verdict as to the acceptability of these, and they're inferior to date beer, well, then probably date beer is in. I think also Rav Huna knows who the student is, that he knows he's a big beer guy.
Mar Yenuka and Mar Kashisha, sons of Rav Ḥisda, said to Rav Ashi.
Wait, I'm just going to pause you.
Yes.
They're sons of Rav Ḥisda, okay? Pay attention. They grew up in his house, and it's a big beer guy, okay? So they probably had the love of beer passed along to them.
Right? Alcohol!
That's right. Okay, all right.
I'm sorry. Once Ameimar visited our place, and we did not have wine for Havdallah. We brought him beer, and he did not separate, and he passed the night fasting. The next day we exerted ourselves and brought him wine, and he separated and tasted some. The next year he again visited our place. We did not have wine, and we brought beer. He said, if so, it is the wine of the country. He separated and tasted some.
It's interesting to consider the chronology of this, because they're sons of Rav Ḥisda, so we saw who he was. Now they're talking to Rav Ashi, so it sounds like they were probably young men when this Ameimar visited, but Rav Ashi is much later. So they're probably old men by the time, and Rav Ashi is probably in his prime, but they're older men. And so they're talking about this story that happened a long time ago. So that's already, first of all, interesting. I'm just thinking about the chronology of it. But secondarily, so we have this two-year situation. Who knows? He could have been visiting a relative. He could have been a scholar of residence, whatever his reason for visiting their town was. But also fascinating, now I'm guessing they must have had enough wine for Friday night, but somehow ran out Saturday night, or maybe they made Kiddush on bread. I don't know. But also that they didn't have wine, when you think about it, is not the most surprising thing, considering that
They own a brewery.
or at least their dad did, and they probably have a similar fondness for beer in their lives, and they clearly had beer, as we see by the end of the story for the second year, right? For the second year, they had beer. The beer was not a problem, fine. He is actually saying this place, the language, the Khmar, this is the wine of the land, the wine of the country, that they don't have wine like I'm used to having wine available. But this is their alcoholic beverage that they enjoy here. That's what they have. That reflects the material reality of what's available. So you know what? It does the same function as wine, and so let's use that. Now this seems like a one-off, right? So the first year he was there visiting, it was a bit of a. He was like, "You don't have wine?" Like it sounds like he just thought like they just didn't have wine. But the next year he realized, oh, this is not a one-off.
Right.
This is constant. This is a constant for this place, and he makes it geographically dependent. Not like, oh, it's just the Rav Ḥisda boys. Like this is.
I've heard this one before.
Right. So this is a very famous story.
Yeah.
But this is the the origins. This is the origin story for making it more permissible. And we have seen some ambiguity going back to the beginning. And even though there's this really clear preference for wine over beer, my sense from reading these texts is that there is a greater, especially by Rav Ḥisda, he's a third generation rabbi, but we're already by Rav. that more and more beer is becoming part of the lives of Jews there, and not only just in what they enjoy, but also commercially, and also becoming more part of religious life as well. And so it's almost like straining the system, like you can't use beer? Are you serious? You can't use, like, we have beer all around, like, but we use beer for this, beer for that, but we're not going to use it the way we use wine, whatever. What we see from text 14, we're about to hit text 15, but what we see from text 14 is that this is a one-off, but at least there is a declaration for Ameimar using this beer for the purposes of Havdallah. But it's not. But he also doesn't say this is a one-off situation. It makes it seem like this is a geographically bounded circumstance. Permissibility. Text 15 refers directly back to 14.
There are 3 items to infer from this story. Infer that one who recites Havdalah in the prayer service must recite Havdalah again over a cup. Infer that it is prohibited for a person to eat before he recites Havdalah. Infer that one who did not recite Havdalah at the conclusion of Shabbat may recite Havdalah anytime during the entire week.
We have these sort of lessons to be drawn out from the drinking story involving Ameimar. So these anonymous rabbis of the Talmud have these 3 lessons they derive from the duo of stories, if you will, of text 14. Finally, I want to say this. We do have text 16, which is Rava, who says one who recites Kiddush over beer, his regular drink should be beer. There's a text right there on the same page where Rava said, I would rather drink like soaking flax water than beer. So like, he really has a massive disgust and dislike of beer. He also is perhaps the Talmud's greatest wine lover, but also he married Rav Ḥisda's daughter. So imagine this. His father-in-law is a big beer guy, but he hates beer. He's disgusted by beer, but his dad loves beer. His father-in-law loves beer. It's also so I just think that's such a funny. Yeah, it must be very interesting. But even by his time, he's still like, nobody should do it. Like, if you want to do Kiddush over beer, fine. And also, he's like, he's dismissing it. But he's also, what is he not doing? He's not saying it's forbidden by this point. That there seems to be an allowance, permissibility. It's not even an outright permissibility. It's almost like a curse. Yeah. Like, oh, you're going to use beer for Kiddush? Well, yeah. Well, maybe all your drinks should be beer. Like, okay, great. Like you don't get to have wine. No wine for you, right? Yeah, and again, like he is a massive wine lover and promoter of wine, and he's like, yeah, you want beer for Kiddush? You should have only beer. So in text 13, we see almost like this growing ambiguity around the use of not only typical beer, which is date beer, but also these other varieties of beer. And then we see text 14, but this could just be a one-off by Ameimar saying, you know what, I'll allow it. You don't really have a lot of wine here, fine. Even though we have these very clear statements in text 8 and 9, no beer should be used for Havdalah and Kiddush. It should be wine, 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 wine. But, we see even Rav who said you got to use wine for Kiddush, doing bread, doing beer, and maybe in a more private fashion than already by later on. So a lot of this stuff is 3rd century, but even by the 4th century, it seems to be, you know what, beer is just so pervasive. Maybe wine is a little bit more challenging to acquire. So it's a little bit of a cliffhanger Talmudically, because there's no clear outright articulation that says, oh, you know what? You can use beer for Kiddush. You can use beer for Havdalah. There's no clear articulation of that in the Talmud. We only really have, when it comes to beer for Havdalah, we have text 14 that seems to be, maybe if you're in a place where wine is not as, available, then you can use beer, fine. But we do have text 16, so it sounds like Rava is aware of people who are doing this. Thank you everybody so much for joining this session on beer for Kiddush and Havdalah, a Talmudic take. And with that, thank you everybody, and L'chaim. L'chaim.